Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is Lauren Flynn with AWWI, and I see that folks are joining the webinar room and have a question here about the audio. This webinar, you should be able to listen through your computer, either computer speakers or if you have headphones, those will work. And we'll be taking all questions in writing, so there's no need to call into the telephone line. You may get a pop-up box when you join, and you can just click Listen Only. If you aren't able to listen through your computer, you can call into the phone line if needed. So you have that option as well. So as folks are getting started, we'll do some introductions, and then we'll dive into the presentation. So today's webinar, this is an NWCC webinar, and it will be on Eagle Research and Mitigation. And as I said, my name is Lauren Flynn, and I'm with the American Wind Wildlife Institute. We've had unprecedented interest in this webinar, which is very exciting, and we had to expand capacity to fit as many people as possible, and we just want to thank everyone for your interest and for joining us today. Since we have some people who may be new to NWCC or AWWI, I wanted to give a brief overview of the two groups. Sorry, I just got some questions here about calling into the phone line. I believe it should give you a pop-up number when you join the webinar room if you need to call into the phone line if you're unable to hear through your computer. So we'll respond to folks in a moment about that. So going back to the introduction about NWCC and AWWI, the NWCC, which stands for the National Wind Coordinating Collaborative, is a group that's been around since 1994. And over the years, it's worked on various issues related to wind power. And currently the focus and for the future is on wind and wildlife issues. AWWI, or the American Wind Wildlife Institute, is a nonprofit organization, and it has a very similar mission to NWCC. And we facilitate the NWCC under a contract with the National Renewable Energy Lab. And we encourage everyone to check out our new and improved websites, both for the NWCC and AWWI, to learn more about our work. One activity that the NWCC does is these quarterly webinars featuring recent research and tools related to wind and wildlife issues. And today's webinar is the first one that we're doing in 2014. So turning to the topic for today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Tabor Allison, who is the Director of Research and Evaluation with AWWI. And he's going to provide updates on two of AWWI's projects, our National Eagle Research Framework, and a voluntary lead abatement model as an option for compensatory mitigation of eagle take. Tabor is an ecologist with special expertise in wind wildlife impacts, and he's been with AWWI since 2010 and previously was the Vice President for Science, Policy, and Climate Change at the Massachusetts Audubon Society. He has a PhD in ecology from the University of Minnesota and a master's in forest science from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ian Evans, who is AWWI's research associate, and he's going to go over a few logistics for today's webinar, and then we'll turn to Tabor for the presentation.
Thanks, Lauren. Like you said, just a couple quick logistical points for everyone. For sound, you should be able to hear us through your computer speakers, and I think a few of you are on the phone as well. If you're having any technical trouble with the webinar, please send me an email. My address is ievans@awwi.org, and I'll help you troubleshoot as best I can. You can also send me a logistics question through the questions box. If you have a question for Tabor, please type it in the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand corner of your webinar screen. You should be able to type your question into the dialog box at the bottom and click the button to the right to send it to us. Feel free to type in questions whenever they come up for you, and after the presentation, Lauren will read the question out loud for the presenters to respond. You will be the only one to see questions you submitted in the box, not those submitted by others. And finally, a reminder that we will be recording this presentation to post on the NWCC site in the next few days to download along with past presentations. And with that, we'd like to turn things over to Tabor.
All right, well, thank you, Ian. Thank you, Lauren, and welcome, everybody. As Lauren mentioned, my presentation today really is two presentations in one, although they're linked. The presentations focus on different elements of what we're calling our EAGLE initiative, the development of a National EAGLE Research Framework to guide research for predicting and mitigating take at wind energy facilities. And I'll provide a broad overview of that framework, and then do a deeper dive into one component of the framework that we began implementing about 1.5 years ago, and have since integrated into the framework that I'll be talking about today. But doing a deeper dive on this voluntary lead abatement model that Lauren described. So our EAGLE initiative, and more specifically the development of our National EAGLE Research Framework, was based on the goal of improving implementation and compliance with the 2009 EAGLE rule, and in implementing the EAGLE Conservation Plan Guidance Module 1 version 2, which is focused on wind energy development. In particular, implementing the EAGLE guidance involves 3 basic steps: collecting data on EAGLE use to accurately predict potential take of eagles by collision or disturbance, implementing advanced conservation practices, or ACPs, that are intended to avoid and minimize that predicted take to the maximum extent practicable, and then implementing compensatory or offset mitigation measures that will offset the remaining unavoidable eagle take. What the framework is not is, as I say, it's focused on the EAGLE Conservation Plan guidance, and it is not intended to address several other important questions about eagle ecology that would be useful to in interpreting or implementing the EAGLE rule and the guidance. And these are, at least some of them are, determining population status of bald and golden eagles. The framework also does not provide guidance on evaluating trends in eagle numbers relevant to establishing eagle take thresholds as outlined in the EAGLE rule, nor does it estimate or focus on estimating the total number of eagles killed at wind energy facilities or eagles killed from any other human source of mortality. We were assisted in the development of this framework by the people you see on the screen here: Todd Katzner, Brian Millsap, Jeff Smith, and Leslie New, who provided comments on drafts of the framework as it was developing. The framework is based on several premises. Some of them will seem obvious, but I think important to state nonetheless. The first of these premises is that indeed eagle fatalities and therefore risk of eagle take will be higher at some facilities than others. Again, I would say that's probably seems self-evident, but important underlying premise of the framework. The framework also is based on evaluating risk factors against the hypothesis that eagle risk is related only to eagle use. Specifically, the service model for predicting take involves measuring eagle activity at the site or eagle use, and the framework is intended to guide research that would help evaluate whether or not there are factors that will either increase eagle risk or reduce risk beyond just eagle use at the site. And then any research, another premise, any research testing advanced conservation practices are presumably tied to fatality monitoring and enhanced fatality monitoring, which we'll talk about in a minute. But evaluating ACPs necessarily involves also evaluating those ACPs in terms of their effects on eagle fatalities. We also, in the framework, make a few study design recommendations that we feel are important in successful implementation of the framework. Projects with high estimated take, we assume, will be the best for evaluating risk factors and ACPs. We also assume that evaluation of risk factors can also include sites with low take as a basis for comparing the presence or absence of the risk factors at these different sites as it relates to the take at the site. Data should be collected at the finest temporal scale to promote pooling and the scaling up of data. And this is important specifically because we expect that research and data will need to be pooled across sites to rigorously and robustly test hypotheses related to risk and related to measures that are intended to avoid and minimize that risk. Because eagle take at any individual facility, even at those facilities that have relatively high take, that take will be low and a relatively infrequent event, and therefore it's unlikely that a single project at a single site will generate enough statistical power to adequately test a hypothesis about risk or about avoiding and minimizing that risk. We're also recommending and assuming that the turbine will typically be the sample unit of interest, although turbine strings may also be the sample unit. And then it's important to make assumptions about the distribution of fatality predictions or estimates to be explicit. Again, because take will generally be low at any individual wind energy facility, depending on your assumptions about the underlying distribution of that take from, as it explains, take from one year to the next, that it's very possible that over a short period of time, take will vary randomly to the extent that it will be very difficult to assign changes in take to either a particular risk factor or a particular ACP. So the framework is divided up into three main sections corresponding to the steps of the Eagle Conservation Plan guidance. I'll just provide an overview of the first two sections, improving take predictions and testing, or avoiding and minimizing take. And then I'll be doing a much deeper dive into the third step, which is compensating for unavoidable take, when I talk about AWWI's project to develop additional options for offset mitigation. So in regard to improving take predictions, the framework recommends a thorough evaluation of existing data on fatalities and risk in order to be able to develop hypotheses related to various risk factors in ACPs. And then the framework also recommends what we're calling enhanced fatality monitoring. And this, the basic purpose of enhanced fatality monitoring is that given that eagle take is infrequent, that the goal is when there is a take event to be able to detect that event. And we provide a little bit of detail on what that might look like. In general, the assumption is that eagle carcasses tend to persist, and therefore it would be more important to increase the aerial coverage of fatality monitoring and potentially offsetting that increased aerial coverage either by surveying larger plots around individual turbines and or surveying more turbines, and you could potentially survey less frequently. But the goal is by surveying more turbines, surveying larger areas to increase the probability of detecting a fatality event when it occurs. Evaluating specific risk factors, turbine location, turbine attributes, environmental features, topographic roughness, for example, characteristics of the eagle population in the area itself, its ecology and behavior, the prey base. These are all potential risk factors that could be evaluated, and they're described in a little more detail in the framework. In evaluating ACPs, it's based on the understanding and really the statement within the conservation guidance that there are no approved ACPs at this point, and any ACP is considered experimental. As I discussed earlier, the testing and evaluation of avoidance and minimization measures will necessarily involve working at projects with take, potentially projects with relatively high take, and pooling data across projects. Options which are described in the framework for potential testing include things like turbine microsighting, curtailment measures, diverters or deterrence measures, perch management, nest management, and prey management. All of these which have been described in some detail as potential options for avoiding and minimizing risk, or pardon me, take. So before I move on to the third section of the framework and talk in more detail about our compensatory mitigation project, I wanted to talk at this point a little bit about the implementation of the framework. The framework was released by AWWI last month and is publicly available, and it has also been provided to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Department of Energy, all of whom might be potential funders of research that is undertaken in the context of this framework. And so we produced this framework in part to help guide the funding of that research. We assume, too, that the funding of the research conducted under this framework would be in the form of public-private partnership, where public funding would be involved, as well as private funding, whether it be from foundations, the industry, or other sources. But it's a recognition that the scope of the research that we're talking about will require substantial amounts of funding. And it will also require a substantial amount of coordination and collaboration, especially to achieve the necessary pooling of data across projects. We envision the creation of a technical advisory committee that would assist with the coordination and review of research conducted under this framework and also help promote collaboration. I see that one way that this could be accomplished is a very transparent process where research collaboratives are formed to develop and design research at multiple projects so that that research can be conducted at multiple projects simultaneously rather than on a project-by-project basis. We also envision that data collected during the course of this framework will be securely stored. As many of you may know, AWWI has created a research information system that is designed to securely store data and make that data available for analysis. And it's very important, we feel, that the data be stored securely, but also be made available to, for analysis and shared to promote synthesis of the data, and again, leading to more robust conclusions. So now I'd like to talk more about the third element of the framework, focusing on compensatory mitigation. As the service outlines in the 2009 Eagle Rule and further elaborates on in the Eagle Conservation Plan guidance, for golden eagles, they've adopted a policy of no net loss, where unavoidable take must be offset by compensatory mitigation that is quantifiable and verifiable and directly and equally offsets any remaining and unavoidable take. This is the case for golden eagles. And I should point out, I didn't mention this at the beginning, the framework is intended to guide research on both bald and golden eagles. The compensatory mitigation work that I'm talking about is focused on golden eagles. So to offset that take, these options that the service identified were eliminating or reducing golden eagle mortality from pre-2009 sources, or enhancing habitat and prey to increase survival or productivity. As we've often heard, you can either then offset the take by saving an eagle or creating an eagle or more. As described in the Eagle Conservation Plan guidance, there are very limited options that have currently been approved for offsetting eagle take and satisfying the requirements of the Eagle Rule and the conservation guidance. Power pole retrofitting is described by the service as one option, one approved option. And in general, as we describe why the challenges for coming up with options is because of the policy of no net loss and the need to quantifiably and verifiably offset take. It is very challenging right now to be able to make a connection with a particular mitigation action and its effect on either decreasing eagle deaths or increasing the number of eagles. In the case of power pole retrofitting, we have models available which tell us that if we retrofit X number of power poles, that will translate into a certain number of, or reduction in the number of eagle deaths due to electrocution. So recognizing that additional options were needed, AWWI launched its what we're calling the Compensatory Mitigation Project, which had the goal of developing predictive models for compensatory mitigation that will numerically and credibly compensate for eagle take at wind energy facilities. Our approach was to start by prototyping with one or a few related mitigation methods in what we're describing as an iterative process with technical experts. We're utilizing a process of expert elicitation to parameterize the models And then our long-term vision is to expand the toolbox to increase the number of quantifiable and verifiable mitigation options. As I mentioned, we're using expert elicitation, and I wanted to just take a few minutes to describe what that is. First of all, as I think we all know, ecological systems have complex dynamics, oftentimes multiple drivers, and typically a lack of data that enable us to understand the dynamics or the drivers of the system. Even with that lack of information, there is a need to make decisions, decisions that are often have to be made and or in where there's an urgent need in conservation management. And when there's hard data lacking, expert knowledge can provide a path forward. What expert elicitation essentially is the use of expert judgment to create models that enable us to make predictions about how a system works. And it's becoming a kind of process that is being used more and more, and there are now formalized procedures to follow that use systematic and well-defined protocols to elicit expert judgment, essentially treating the elicitation of expert judgment as a process of data acquisition, and with the protocols in place that can attempt to deal with the recognized sources of uncertainty that are inherent in the process. So what AWWI did to begin this process was an initial elicitation, if you will, of expert judgment to identify potential mitigation sources as a way of helping us determine where to begin. As I mentioned, our plan was to start by prototyping one or a few related models, and so we initially solicited expert opinion to help us identify which model to begin with. So we asked experts to evaluate factors that affect eagle populations, and then evaluate the potential effectiveness of mitigation to reduce the importance of that factor on eagle populations. And what you can see here is the result of that initial elicitation with the factor effect. The higher the number, the higher the judgment of the respondents to the importance of this factor affecting eagle populations. So you see loss of high quality habitat had the highest effect, judged effect on eagle populations. And then the mitigation effect also from low being relatively limited effect to high being having a large effect on reducing the importance of the factor. And so by this judgment, lead poisoning came out on top as the most important factor and potentially the most useful beginning, if you will, for looking at potential mitigation sources, was tied with loss of high quality habitat. And basically because of our interpretation of the Eagle Rule and the guidance, we didn't feel that habitat protection was a potential source of mitigation. So you can see the other options that are in bold that we'll talk a little bit more about at the end, but vehicle collisions, eagles in this case getting hit by vehicles as they feed on roadkill, habitat restoration as a means to improve carrying capacity of eagles, and then improving or reducing disturbances to nests or nest sites. So based on this initial elicitation and discussions with experts, we chose to focus on lead poisoning and voluntary measures to reduce eagle poisoning from lead. And so in the context of what I was describing before, in terms of potential voluntary lead abatement strategies, the strategies are well known, I think. One of the obvious ones is encouraging hunters to use non-lead ammo, such as copper ammo, which will reduce the amount of lead in the environment. And the big question mark is if we, for example, were successful in reducing lead in the environment through ammo substitution, if we were able to reduce that amount by 10 or 20%, what would be the net change in eagles? So our goal was to build a model that would enable us to make that prediction. So the process of model development, we assembled a team of eagle biologists and lead toxicologists as our experts. We utilized a structured approach to elicit the judgment of these experts, both in the design of our model and as well as the parameter values. I can see I have a typo there, but that should be parameter values of the model. And then we created a custom computer model that estimated eagle deaths due to lead exposure in a specific geographic area. In other words, the model is spatially based. And in this case, we chose Wyoming for reasons that I'll discuss in more detail in a little bit. And also, we focused on a specific time period, the big game harvest season. So the model that we developed will estimate eagle deaths due to lead exposure in Wyoming, resulting from lead that is added to the system by hunters shooting big game in the fall season. We, through this process of expert elicitation, we elicited the judgment of experts and of multiple experts for each parameter value, and we captured both the uncertainty of the individual experts, recognizing in the process of elicitation that an expert's judgment about a particular parameter had a level of uncertainty, and then there was variation between experts or among experts, and so these sources of variation in the parameter values were captured as probability distributions. We then generated a variance in expected outcomes in the computer model by 1,000 simulations with stochastic sampling. So in other words, we generated output using the parameters developed from the judgment of the experts, and then ran simulations to generate an outcome. And then we conducted sensitivity analyses to determine the importance in particular of key parameters such as the maximum number of gut piles eaten, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, blood lead exposure, and then mortality rate due to blood lead. We followed an iterative process. So working with our experts, we would elicit their judgments, we would incorporate their judgments, and then feed the results back to the experts. We would discuss the results with the experts. This could lead to a revision of the elicitation results, or potentially eliciting their judgments for a particular parameter again. And then we incorporated those results into the model, generated outcomes, and then presented those results to our experts. And based on the continued feedback from our experts, we revised the model and are now getting ready to write the results up. Here's a list of our participating experts. Experts in the red font were our lead toxicology experts, and the black font represented our EAGLE experts. These were the individuals whose judgment we elicited to help us build and parameterize our model. The model incorporates several assumptions, and wanted to describe those briefly. One thing I should mention specifically, I should have mentioned this earlier, but the main source of lead for eagles during the big game harvest season are the gut piles that are left behind by hunters who clean their carcasses in the field, take the carcass out, and leave the gut pile behind. The gut piles contain lead fragments at various quantity. The eagles eat these gut piles, and in so doing may ingest lead, and that lead may find its way into the eagle's bloodstream. The eagles, as I mentioned, we assume are adept at finding these gut piles, and we're assuming that the scavenging rate of gut piles by eagles can be calculated directly from eagle density. We assume that maximum blood lead is a useful index of lead exposure and potential mortality, and that predicting probability of acute poisoning mortality within 1 month of exposure is a reasonable approach, because blood lead varies and will decline after an initial exposure. And that also the population-based approach that we used accurately represents natural variation in individual eagle deaths. So in other words, we chose a population-based modeling approach rather than an individual-based modeling approach. To do this work, we held an in-person workshop and then several web conference meetings to talk about the work with the experts and conduct the elicitations. We got a working model built through the program MATLAB, and this model estimates the number of adult golden eagles saved due to mitigation implemented during, as I say, the fall big game harvest period. And we can run scenarios with the status quo and alternative degrees of lead abatement mitigation. So here now, after all of that, is the basic model. We start out with our baseline, and what you're seeing here is an influence diagram.
Tabor, Tabor, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm going to pull up the arrow, which you could drag around so you can point at things.
How do I do it?
If you just click on it and drag it, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So ultimately, as we can see over here, the model is intended to predict the number of eagle deaths, and it predicts the number of those deaths as a function of the golden eagle density, the gut pile scavenging rate, and the game harvest and game recovery rate. So these numbers over here, the golden eagle density and the gut pile scavenging rate, estimate exposure, if you will. And then the game harvest here represents the amount of, ultimately the amount of lead that comes into the environment through gut piles. And then we have additional parameters that, try and grab this, look at the lead absorption of the blood lead per scavenge, and then also the probability of death as a function of blood lead. So our first goal then was, through this baseline model, was to estimate the number of eagles that are dying as a result of lead input through big game harvesting. And then what you can do is add additional variables, which are the mitigation scenarios. And the mitigation scenarios that we looked at were gut pile removal, so coming up with ways to provide incentives for hunters to remove the gut pile and therefore remove the lead from the environment, or alternatively to substitute to a non-lead ammo. As you can see by the arrows, which indicate the relationship between the different variables, gut pile removed obviously influences the number of gut piles available, which would, in theory, affect the scavenging of golden eagles and the amount of exposure, whereas ammo substitution will change the percentage of gut piles with lead. So this was the basic model that we've been working with. And just want to highlight next are the sources of data that were used to parameterize these variables on the outside of this flow diagram, with the assumption that these other variables in the white boxes are influenced by these variables in the colored boxes. So golden eagle density, we have estimated for Wyoming from the modeling work that West has done, West Inc. Many of you may be familiar that West has been conducting aerial surveys of late summer golden eagle density in several bird conservation regions that includes Wyoming. And we asked them to, using those data, to create a habitat selection model for Wyoming that would assign golden eagle density to locations in Wyoming. The game harvest data comes from Wyoming Game and Fish. The Wyoming Game and Fish identify game harvest units, and so for each of those game management units, we have harvest data for the major big game species: elk, moose, mule deer, and pronghorn. So we have numbers in each game management unit for each of those species. And then West came up with an estimated golden eagle density in each of those game management units. We used the literature available on other programs that are looking at voluntary lead abatement, such as in northern Arizona, to get some estimates on success or participation in the mitigation efforts. And then the boxes outlined in yellow here, for example, where we obtained information on those variables from expert judgment. So the gut pile scavenging rate was estimated through this process of expert elicitation with our eagle experts, and the lead absorption and probability of death from lead was an elicitation exercise with our lead toxicology experts. This is what basically the results of a sample elicitation. I don't expect you to absorb all of this, but I wanted you to see that basically here was the raw data that we were working with, excuse me, as a result of our elicitations. We would ask the experts a specific question, and then we would ask them for their lowest reasonable estimate, their highest reasonable estimate, and their best estimate. So we were eliciting both their best judgment as well as asking them to provide an estimate of their uncertainty of that estimate. And as I mentioned, we had multiple experts that we were eliciting information from, and you can see here just some of the range of variation in one of the parameters that we were trying to estimate. And for each of these elicitations, we would combine this diversity both in terms of the variation within an expert's judgment and among experts in the form of probability distributions for each of the parameters. And then that probability distribution would serve as the basis for conducting the simulations where, through a stochastic process, we would choose a number from within that distribution and simulate the model and repeat that 1,000 times to generate output. Here's just one example, one result that I'll show you. And in this case, we're looking at comparing the effectiveness of using copper bullets or non-lead ammo versus removing gut piles for reducing the number of eagle deaths. The results you see graphed here are based on 100 iterations of the model. The dashed line is non-lead ammo here, and the solid line is gut pile removal at two different eagle densities. The main point to make here is that based on the information that we included in the model, both the model design and the assumptions about eagle foraging rate and availability of gut piles, suggests that ammo substitution, the dotted line and the steeper slope, is a much more effective source of mitigation or lead abatement than gut pile removal. And this is largely due to our determination and our assumption, if you will, that eagles during the big game hunting season are saturated with gut piles. And so removing gut piles, small proportions of gut piles, has very limited effect on eagle exposure to lead because there are more than enough gut piles for them to go along, whereas when you substitute ammo, there's essentially a direct relationship between ammo, percent non-lead ammo, and the percentage of gut piles with lead. And so eagle exposure to lead drops off in a more predictable fashion. So this is an interesting result, and in terms of implementing and trying to provide incentives to hunters, it suggests that providing incentives for hunters to substitute ammo would be a much more effective mitigation option than asking them to lug out very heavy gut piles. So, whoops, excuse me. going to move this out of the way. So some additional steps that can be taken. We can refine the model to reflect regional details and specific mitigation methods. The model, because it's spatially based, can be readily adapted to other states where there's a potential to use this source of mitigation, such as the Pacific Northwest. You can adapt it to based on getting data inputs from, say, Oregon or the state of Washington. The model can be used to evaluate specific mitigation strategies and those uncertainties, and it can also help us design adaptive management approaches and monitoring priorities and protocols. Essentially, the model is a prediction based on the best expert judgment, both from our participating experts and what's available in the literature, and it needs to be evaluated in the field. And the model, both through the sensitivity analysis and other approaches, can help us determine which variables should be examined in the field as a way of evaluating the model and evaluating the success of the mitigation. To implement this model will involve working both with the state and federal wildlife agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service in particular, because they're the ones who would have to accept this model as a potential source of mitigation. State agencies who are responsible for coordinating, managing the hunt and hunting will need to be involved, presumably at some level, and then the industry who would be proposing this approach as a potential mitigation option. AWWI has had conversations throughout this process with all of these stakeholders, as well as conservation groups, as we've developed this model to ensure, or at least increase the likelihood, that it will be a practical approach to mitigation and meet the needs of both the industry partners who are seeking mitigation options and the service who are looking for options, looking to see how potential take or predicted take is offset at a particular project. As I mentioned, we've focused on lead inputs during the big game harvest season, and there are other additional sources of lead that get into the environment. Varmint hunting is a major source. One estimate for, I can't remember, one of the Dakotas was that 1 million prairie dogs are shot every year, which represents an enormous amount of lead input into the environment. We're also using late summer eagle densities, and migrant and wintering populations of eagles are also ingesting lead, and so that would be another variation to the model. We are in the process of writing the results of this model up, and we'll be submitting to a peer-reviewed journal shortly. And we've also begun the process of creating our next model, which will focus on eagle mortality from vehicle collisions. And we hope to complete that sometime this fall. And we will also be looking at potentially developing models on prey habitat, improving carrying capacity for eagles, which will involve vegetation management for prey, and we'll be scoping that as well in the next months to come. So that's all I have, and I'm happy happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Tabor. So as a reminder, we'll be taking questions in writing through the webinar room, and you should see a box that's titled Q&A on the right-hand corner of your screen. At the bottom of that, there's a space where you can type your question in and send it our way. We've got a couple so far. So, Tabor, I'll start with more of a clarification question. Going back to the slide where you had the figures, they were asking about the metric for the x-axis for copper ammo. So if maybe you can go back to that slide. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's an error. It should be proportion of bullets, of substitution. When I put that figure together, I inadvertently used the same x-axis, but it's for copper, it would be proportion of bullets substituted, non-lead ammo.
Okay, thank you.
So 0.1 is 10% ammo substitution. 0.2 is 20% ammo substitution.
Great, thank you.
Hope that clears it up, and I apologize for that.
Okay, so this next question, I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer. It may be more of a legal question, but I thought I'd put it out there and see if you have any thoughts. And it's asking about gut pile removal related to the EAGLE Act, which talks about interfering with normal feeding behaviors, and whether gut pile removal would be consistent with the EAGLE Act.
Well, that's a good question. I can't answer that. There are a number or multiple forms of mitigation, whether they're be in the form of ACPs that have been discussed like this, that involve reducing EAGLE activity in an area where a project is being developed, which would involve reducing the prey base. And this question that you're raising and that option of reducing the prey base raise similar questions as to when does this sort of thing constitute a taking in and of itself. And I don't know the answer to that, and I'm not sure that I haven't seen anything which specifically addresses that question.
Okay, thank you. Okay, another question looking at copper ammo versus gut pile removal, and is asking that, is it possible that hunter compliance rates with gut pile removal requirements would exceed adoption rates of non-lead bullets to such an extent that gut pile removal becomes the more viable option?
Well, that's a good question. And, the short answer is I don't know. I think you'd have to remove a lot of gut piles to get to the point where it's equivalent. And one of the things that I've heard in talking with hunters in particular about this approach is that getting the hunter to remove a gut pile is not, doesn't sound like a viable option. Gut piles are very heavy, and I think you probably need a lot of incentives to get a hunter to remove a gut pile. But, I have to go back and look at the results of our simulations, and particularly this x-axis here, to see if these two lines ultimately converge before they reach 100%. I mean, at some point, if you remove all the gut piles or substitute all the ammo, then yes, they'll converge. But whether gut pile removal becomes a more viable option before that, and at what level, I have to go back and look at our results.
Okay, thanks. So this question is kind of looking at implementation, and if you can speak more about kind of real-world examples of how a lead abatement program might be implemented, and how a developer could create or contribute to a lead abatement program that would have success in reducing the amount of lead ammo used by hunters, and how success of a developer's contribution to the lead abatement might be measured.
Yeah, I mean, now these are all good questions, and at this point, we haven't really focused on the specifics of how a particular mitigation plan would work. And so, you know, to your point, you'd have to figure out a way of essentially monetizing the desired mitigation. So what sort of financial incentives, for example, do you need to provide hunters to get them to substitute ammo, and what would it take to achieve a 10% substitution? One approach would be to focus the mitigation on particular management units, game management units. So a company could, and our modeling can be specific to, can produce an outcome specific to a game management unit. So a company could say, well, we're going to invest in ammo substitution for hunters using this game management unit. And there can be estimates of the number of hunters and the amount of ammunition that it would take to achieve the desired level of compliance. And that kind of modeling of the financial requirement is something that we haven't done yet. Our focus, first of all, was to attempt to build what we hope will be seen as a scientifically credible model that estimates whether or not the mitigation is effective. And we wanted to see whether or not you could achieve levels of mitigation that would be sufficient to offset potential eagle take. And I think the answer to that is yes, that there is potential mitigation, a sufficient mitigation potential. Of course, whether or not it's scientifically credible remains to be, is in the hands of the peer review.
Great, thank you. This question is asking if you looked at gut pile burial at all at the kill site rather than removal of the gut pile.
Well, we haven't looked at it. I think it's a potential option. It's been suggested. I guess the question would be how effective burial would be. Scavengers can dig up buried carcasses and buried gut piles, and if a gut pile is dug up, then it potentially becomes available to all scavengers, including golden eagles. And I think, again, the results suggest that it's be a better use of mitigation effort to get hunters to substitute ammo rather than having them dispose of gut piles.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question. I'm not sure how much you can speak to it, but you may have some information to share, asking about the barriers to implementing a change in ammunition type, and if there's a cost or are there other reasons that there might be any resistance to changing ammunition type.
Well, I'm not a hunter, so what I've heard about this is based on what I've heard from hunters, and there is a cost factor that lead ammo is less expensive perhaps substantially less expensive than non-lead sources like copper. My understanding also is that, for lack of a better way to describe it, the kill potential of the bullet is different. I mean, one of the things that makes the reasons why lead is a problem for scavengers and why it gets into the gut pile is the same reason that makes it an effective ammunition for hunting, is because it does fragment, and those fragments penetrate a lot of other tissues in the animal, spreading the force of the bullet and increasing the kill potential of a particular shot. Whereas I've heard with non-lead ammo like copper, the bullet can pass all the way through the animal and not necessarily kill it. But there are others who could probably speak to that better than I. I've heard different stories about ballistics of copper versus, for example, copper and lead. And so I've heard that people say that the ballistics are very different. I've heard some people say that copper is superior, lead is superior, so I'm not really sure. But I think there are enough examples out there that show that hunters are willing to switch. And a company could institute or implement a potential implementation program by either providing ammunition free or reducing the cost so that hunters will have the incentive to switch.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. Had a couple questions related to the fact that in some places lead bullets have already been, the laws about lead bullets have been put in place, and so there are changes already happening, and how that might impact the use of this approach for mitigation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, can you repeat that, please?
So that in some places, use of lead has already been regulated or reduced through programs, and if those changes happening otherwise, how that relates to using this approach for mitigation.
Well, certainly. We're familiar with what happened in California. I can't remember the date when the ban on lead in ammunition goes into effect. It's sometime a few years into the future, but if lead were banned as an ammunition, that would have an effect on the utility of this mitigation approach. I don't know when that's going to happen, and I think it's still useful to have this option available to voluntarily reduce lead in the environment.
Okay, thanks. Going to back to a more specific question about the model, does it assume that all sportsmen currently use lead ammo?
No. Let me just go back to, so if we look at this model here, you can see here are the number of gut piles, and then down here we have a variable percent gut piles with lead. So this is part of the base model, and whether or not there is an ammo substitution program, you can still model a certain percentage of hunters which are already using a non-lead ammo. So, this number here is, as it's applied in the iteration of the model, is generated from a distribution. So it does not assume, the model does not assume that all gut piles have lead in them.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. We had a couple questions kind of looking forward to the other models, and one asking if you could say any more about the development of the model to improve prey habitat as a mitigation option, and kind of what's the timeline for that?
Well, as I mentioned, we're going to work on the vehicle collision model first. And so I'd say the prey habitat model will not be worked on until the late fall at the earliest. And that judgment to, the sequence in which we chose to work on these models reflects the input we got from our Eagle experts, that the sequence would be that would be best to follow in model development is lead abatement, then vehicle collisions. Habitat management to increase prey. I mean, I frankly think that would be ultimately the most useful approach. It has a lot of challenges. One of the opinions that was expressed strongly was that, particularly working in areas of high eagle abundance, you're working in areas of low precipitation, and managing vegetation to increase the number of black-tailed jackrabbits, for example, can be very difficult when you are working in an area of low precipitation. So we chose to put off working on that initially, but I want to come back to that particular model, and I'm hoping to do that by the end of this year.
Great, thank you. One question is asking about if industry or companies are interested in participating in the studies. I think maybe talking about testing the models once they're ready. Would that be helpful, and how would a company express interest in participating in that?
It would be very helpful, and I think I'm assuming that any initial implementation of this model will have embedded in it an evaluation component. And so what would be helpful, and some of the preliminary conversations that we've had with state agencies and industry have been talking about how to implement this model and evaluate the model in the field and the results in the field to determine whether or not the predictions are being borne out, and how the model parameters can be adjusted. One of the things that I didn't mention is that expert elicitation tends to be done in a Bayesian statistical environment. So you can effectively think of all of these parameters in the model as priors that can be measured and then modified based on data collected in the field. And I'm hoping that that's what we'll do. And so we are hoping to work with companies to set up field tests of the model. And so if a company is interested in working with us, the simplest thing is for them to get in touch with us. One of the nice things about the structure of AWWI is that we have both industry partners and state wildlife agencies as partners. So we have a good communication link between as the groups, as well as conservation NGOs, which I think will facilitate the kind of collaboration we need to evaluate the model.
Great, thank you. And I would just add that on the AWWI website you can find the contact information for all of us, and you're welcome to reach out by email or telephone if you want to have further conversations. All right, let's see. One question here, I'm not sure if I understand it, but maybe it will be clearer to you, Tabor, asking if we would be expanding the models to industrial, mining, or forestry examples because it could be useful to have scientific justification of the value of mitigation measures when preparing environmental assessments.
I guess the short answer is we hadn't thought that far ahead. But I'd be happy to talk about it further. I think because of who we are, our focus has been on wind energy development and eagles. And let's assume and hope that this model gets published, and then either the model itself or the framework by which the model was created could be certainly used and adapted by others.
Great, thank you. All right, well, I think time to wrap up, and if we didn't get a chance to get to your question, we will follow up afterwards. Wanted to remind everyone that we will post the recording of this as well as the PowerPoint on the NWCC website. And the place to find that on the website is if you go to the home page and you look at the top menu bar, all of the NWCC materials are under research. And if you go to that category, there's a subcategory called webinars. And that page should have the information about this webinar and then all the ones on wildlife that we've done in the past. And if you have any trouble finding anything, feel free to reach out to me, and I can point you in the right direction. So let's see. All right. I think with that, we can wrap up for today. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join. We really appreciate the interest, and have a great afternoon. And thank you, Tabor.
You're welcome, and thank you all for joining us.
Bye-bye.